Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. If you want to understand where American democracy is headed, don't just watch the rallies or the cable shout fests. Watch the Supreme Court docket. This term, a cluster of cases, is asking a deceptively simple question. How much of the modern state does one president get to control, and how much of it is truly beyond his reach? That question is now on the table in three ways. A case about Trump's tariffs and emergency powers, a case about whether he can fire the heads of independent agencies at will, and a case about whether he can remove a sitting Federal Reserve governor in the middle of her term. Taken together, they're not just about Trump's second term. They're about whether the administrative state that's grown over the last century stays semi-independent and technocratic, or slowly becomes a presidential patronage machine. Start with the tariffs. Earlier this term, the Supreme Court handed Trump one of his biggest legal defeats of the second term by striking down his sweeping reciprocal tariffs, which he had justified under an emergency economic powers statute. He tried to turn a law meant for specific foreign threats into a standing license to rewrite trade policy on his own. A six-justice majority said no. The statute's language about regulating imports in an emergency wasn't clear authorization for permanently reshaping the entire tariff schedule. The court called that a remarkable claim of power. On paper, that sounds like a reassuring civics textbook moment. Congress writes the trade laws, not the president. But look what the court didn't do. It didn't question the president's ability to declare the underlying emergency. It didn't really cabin the sprawling web of other emergency and trade authorities presidents already have. And it brushed past what should happen to the billions already collected under the invalid tariffs. So you get a limit on one particularly aggressive move without a robust theory of how Congress can delegate economic power before it hands the president a blank check. That's the tension running through this whole term. On the one hand, conservatives on the court flirt with reviving the non-delegation doctrine, the idea that Congress can't just hand vast policymaking power to agencies or presidents with no real limits. On the other hand, the same majority often seems perfectly comfortable with enormous delegations as long as they align with the policy direction they like. The tariff case lands right in the middle, a warning shot at plainly abusive uses of vague statutes, but not a broader effort to rein in the architecture of presidential emergency power. Now shift to the second front. Firing the independent referees. To see what's at stake, you have to go back to a 1935 case called Humphrey's Executor. That decision upheld Congress's choice to shield members of the Federal Trade Commission from at-will presidential firing. Commissioners could only be removed for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. The court said that was fine because agencies like the FTC weren't purely executive. They did quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial work and could be insulated from day-to-day politics. That ruling became a pillar in the modern administrative state. It's why we talk about independent regulators at the FTC, SEC, NLRB, and the Fed. Trump's legal team wants to blow a hole in that structure. One marquee case this term involves his firing of a Federal Trade Commission commissioner, even though the statute limits removal to specific causes. The administration's argument is sweeping. If an officer exercised significant executive power, the president must be able to remove that person at will. For cause protections, they say, are unconstitutional shackles on the president's duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. At argument, Trump's Solicitor General all but invited the court to either narrow Humphrey's executor beyond recognition or overturn it outright. Everyone in the room understood what that would mean. If the president can fire FTC commissioners at will, why not the SEC, the National Labor Relations Board, or other boards we've treated as independents for decades? Business and political actors are watching closely because it would shift the center of gravity for regulation even more decisively toward the White House. You'd still have agencies on paper, but their leadership would become more precarious, more partisan, and more directly responsive to the president's whims. And that's before we even get to the Federal Reserve. Nothing illustrates the collision between presidential power and technocratic independence better than Trump v. Cook, the case about whether he can fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. Fed governors are appointed to long terms that can only be removed for cause. Historically, presidents have treated that language as real protection. In over a century of the Fed's existence, no president has ever actually fired a governor midterm. Trump decided to be the first. Citing alleged misstatements on Crook's mortgage applications, he moved to remove her on integrity grounds, arguing that someone who may have lied on a mortgage can't credibly help set interest rates for the country. Cook sued. A district judge blocked the firing, saying the administration hadn't shown valid cause, and the case rocketed to the Supreme Court. Here's the key. This isn't a direct constitutional attack on the Fed's for cause protection. Trump isn't asking the court to strike down the statute. He's asking them to interpret for cause so broadly that it becomes almost whatever the president says it is. In his telling, courts should largely defer. If the president says certain alleged conduct undermines confidence in the Fed, that should be enough to satisfy cause. Cook argues that if that's the rule, the Fed's independence evaporates overnight. Any governor who crosses the president on interest rates or regulation could suddenly find themselves accused of some unrelated flaw and shoved out. Markets would get the message quickly. Monetary policy is now a partisan weapon, and the central bank's proposed insulation from politics is a fiction. The justices seem torn. Some conservatives worried that demanding detailed, judiciously enforced standards for cause would drag courts into micromanaging personnel decisions. Others clearly didn't love the optics of blessing the very first firing of a Fed governor on a thin and contested record. The three liberals homed in on the bigger picture. If you let this go through, what's left of central bank independence? Think about how all this fits together. On tariffs, the court was willing to say, no, you cannot conjure up limitless trade authority from stray words in an emergency law. On independent agencies, it looks increasingly ready to say, yes, the president can directly control far more of the people who run the regulatory state than we used to think. And in Trump v. Cook, it has decided whether statutory for-cause protections really protect anyone, or whether presidential discretion can swallow them whole. That's not a simple strong president, weak president story. It's more subtle. The court is skeptical of some unilateral moves, especially when they look like wild overreaches unmoored from statutory text, while being surprisingly open to a broader project of bringing the administrative state under tighter presidential control. The message is, you can't just rewrite trade law by screaming emergency, but you can have far more say over who runs the agencies, boards, and commissions that implement those laws. From the perspective of democratic resilience, that's dangerous. Congress can keep delegating power on everything from the environment to financial markets. But if the people wielding that power are increasingly at will presidential loyalists, independence becomes a slogan, not a reality. Non-delegation doctrine, in theory, is about stopping Congress from giving away too much power. In practice, this court may end up leaving the delegations in place while shifting control over the delegates. The result is an administrative state that still exists, but with thinner guardrails. A president who can't legally slap tariffs on every import might still be able to handpick trade regulators who will stretch every statute in his preferred direction. A president who can't directly set interest rates might still be able to intimidate or oust the governors who insist on putting long-term economic stability over short-term political gain. And remember, whatever tools this president wins, the next president inherits. If the court says Trump can fire commissioners at will, a future president, maybe one with a very different agenda, will have that same power. If the court turns for cause into a rubber stamp, both parties will be tempted to weaponize that leeway whenever a regulator stands in their way. That's how decisions look, technical and incremental in 2026, can leave structural marks on American governance for decades. So why should anyone outside of law school care about this term? Because these cases will shape realities you can feel. They influence whether a union drive succeeds, whether inflation is tamed with minimal pain, whether a small business survives a trade shock, whether environmental and financial regulations are enforced by experts or gutted by ideologues. The story of the 2025-26 term is, in many ways, the story of a president who sees independent institutions as obstacles, not guardrails, running into a Supreme Court that largely shares his skepticism of the administrative state, but not always his methods. By the time this term ends, we'll know more about which of Trump's power grabs the court is willing to ratify and which lines it is still willing to draw. And that choice won't just matter for Donald Trump. It will matter for whoever comes next and for how much of our government remains run by law and institutions rather than by the will of a single person at the top. Congress can delegate economic power before it hands its president a blank check. Thank you for listening. This has been America's Fractured Politics. I hope you'll listen in next time, and until then, thank you.